Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Tristan. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. According to Chartable, in 2020, 600 branded podcasts released their first episode. And in 2021, we'll see more branded podcasts rolled out. But with podcasts, it's hard to determine if it's working. And marketers have to constantly answer the question, what is the ROI of my company's podcast? So today, I have Dave Zohrob on the show. Dave is the co-founder and CEO of Chartable, a podcast analytics and attribution company. And in this conversation, you'll learn how to make it super easy to measure, grow, and get results from your branded podcast. So let's jump in. All right, Dave. So I know Chartable takes the guesswork out of podcast analytics and attribution. And so when COVID hit last year, you had really kind of this direct insight or direct line into how podcasts were performing, right? And so I heard you on another podcast that I was listening to, doing some research, and you said that you were pessimistic at first and thought maybe the world was going to end, with podcasts and how people were normally listening on their commutes and so forth, but it didn't. So what does the data say about the overall podcast audience in the last year?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I was totally freaked out. I was honestly too freaked out. I mean, and it was a scary time, and I'm based in New York, and so COVID hit here, pretty much first in the US, and it hit really hard. And it was scary. We stopped going in the office. I got sick pretty early on. It's weird to think back to that time of such uncertainty. And so I was living through that uncertainty and then also seeing the data coming in and thinking, oh no, commutes went away, right? Everybody who could, who didn't have to go into work stayed home. And there's all kinds of survey data on how or where people listen to podcasts and, the way that it's usually framed. And a lot of this comes from the excellent folks at Edison Research, who do the industry standard share of ear and infinite dial reports, which if you haven't seen them, I'm sure everyone listening has seen them, but if you haven't, go check them out. Yeah. They show that at home is the most common listening place. And cars or public transit are, up there in the list of top locations. But asking people what their most common listening place is isn't the same as how many hours are you listening in the car versus on a train versus at home.
Right.
And so what we had was a sort of natural experiment where we, commuting went to almost zero. And what we saw was that consumption dropped in the very immediate term, right around the mid-March of 2020, dropped depending on the show, 15 to 25%, which is a lot. So just kind of lopped off the top. Downloads weren't hit quite as bad, but listening took a hit. And, we see this across a lot of different publishers. That said, it all recovered pretty fast. I was worried that it wouldn't recover quickly, that we were in for some, there are all kinds of prognostications going on at that time, right? That the world is going to change permanently and, media consumption would change and everyone's spending all this time on the couch and Netflix consumption went up like crazy and Disney Plus came out. A lot of changes happened, but ultimately we saw full recovery by end of May, early June, which is pretty fast considering how we were still, in the throes of the pandemic. It was less bad last summer, but people found new ways to listen. Listening is important to people, right? And for me, I created a new routine. I used to take the train into the city pretty frequently. That went away, but now I have my morning walk. I go on and I got my podcast time, and I don't know if I'm listening the exact same amount, but I certainly am listening a lot, way more than I was right at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think that was true for a lot of people. People found their way of listening. And so what we're seeing now, like I said, we saw a total recovery by May, June, and it's been growing since then, back on the same trajectory. And from a totally zoomed out perspective, a lot of the growth in listenership is driven by Spotify's super aggressive investment in podcasting.
Yeah.
And they're doing it because it's great for them. They own a lot of shows. They have this app. They want you to spend a lot of time in their app. But also because the Android story for podcasting has always been different than iPhone. If you own an iPhone, you have a great podcast app built in. You open it up, it's right there. It's been there for years. And that's never really been the case for Android. I mean, obviously, Google's been trying for a while and has tried multiple times to bring a good Android experience to some wonderful independent apps. But, tens of millions of people have Spotify in the US, and half or more of them are on Android. So those people, a lot of those people are listening to podcasts for the first time in the last year, which is amazing.
Yeah, that's a good point there. And another trend that I wanted to talk about, and it's actually how I found you originally, was a blog post with the title of, let me make sure I get it right, Why Branded Podcasts Are Exploding and Why We Built Chartable for Brands. So that's what I first found.
Yeah.
And the article mentioned how in 2020, there were 600 branded podcasts released where they released their first episode. And then it looks like in 2021, we're going to eclipse that number. So when did you say at Chartable, hey, branded podcasts is a thing that's exploding and we need to take note of that. And we're going to actually create Chartable for brands?
Yeah. So I think we were actually pretty late on this. We worked really closely with all kinds of publishers and agencies. But we've been working with the folks at Pacific Content up in Canada. We're now part of Rogers Media almost since day one. The folks on their team were very early adopters of what we do, and they only do branded podcasts.
Yeah.
They've been doing them for many years. They do a great job. And, even though they were one of our first and best customers, I somehow didn't really fully comprehend what they were doing and the kind of trends that they were betting on.
Yeah.
The idea being, and I could borrow some of their terminology here, that businesses increasingly are going to look to build their own audience versus renting it from someone else.
Right.
And renting an audience can be fantastic. That's like the entire podcast advertising business is built on that. It's going to be $1 billion business this year and a $2 billion business within another couple of years. That's great. And for a lot of companies, that's like going to be a huge part of their strategy, even if they do their own show. But increasingly, we see folks looking to build audiences on their own. And podcasting has a number of advantages compared to other media, which anyone familiar with podcasting already knows. But like you spend a lot of time with podcasts. You're not listening to multiple podcasts at the same time. Distribution is owned entirely by the publisher. You get to choose which platforms you want it to be on, and how often you release, and whether or not you have ads, and all this other wonderful stuff. Control you have with podcasting that you don't have with other channels. And we see a megatrend of companies starting podcasts that was basically right under our noses the whole time. Since we started the company, we've been collecting data on the entire podcast industry and trying to index as many podcasts that we can. And there have been folks using podcasts for business almost since the birth of podcasting. But we see rapid growth in that use case in the last few years. And we see it being a mega trend that we're, investing resources on our side, because just like everyone else in podcasting, businesses face challenges, reaching an audience, understanding their audience, growing their audience, and measuring the effect of their shows. And we happen to have spent several years investing in this stuff for media companies and for advertisers. And so it's really not that different. It's a slight change, slight repackaging of the product, but everybody's got the same problems.
Yeah.
The flip side of the wonderful openness of the podcast ecosystem, where you get to have this control of, how you distribute and how often you release and all this other wonderful stuff, which technology you use, et cetera. You don't know who's listening on the other side.
Right.
The same way that, I don't know who's listening to my podcast. The New York Times has the same problem, but they don't know who's listening to the Daily, right? So whether you have millions of downloads or 100 downloads like me, you got the same problem. The difference is that for businesses who are not doing ad-supported shows, they're not trying to get millions of downloads necessarily. I mean, maybe if they're a huge B2C brand, they have that goal somewhere. But for most businesses, especially B2B, you're not looking to get millions of downloads. You're looking to reach the right people and to get them to spend a lot of time with you. And so that when the time comes for them to make some kind of purchase, whether it's for software or something else, that you're top of mind, and that they've spent hours with your brand, they spend hours with your content and hours with you, hopefully, and see you as an expert, and you can be part of that purchase decision for them. And so we're working with all kinds of companies on this stuff. I always use software as an example because I'm a programmer, and that's the world I live in. Yeah. But we have a friend of mine who's runs a software company out in San Francisco. They sell machine learning and AI tools. So it's like super specialized stuff for like advanced practitioners of machine learning and AI, running like teams of engineers doing this stuff. Yeah. They build software for that use case. Software costs a lot of money. The number of people who are buying it is not that big. I mean, I'm sure it's big. I mean, he's got great business, but like not like millions of people listening to the daily. None of those, very few of those people are going to be interested in buying this software.
Right.
But he has a show that he hosts. It's called Gradient Descent, which is apparently some kind of pun on a machine learning concept, which flies right over my head.
Only that audience will understand.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a good indicator.
He knows his audience. Yeah, right. Yeah, and so he gets like a nice number of downloads for a B2B show. And he gets to interview customers and friends. He loves doing it. And if he lands like one contract in like, even in like 3 years of doing the show, and I'm sure he's already landed more than one, it's completely worth it. It pays for everything, right? It's just, and that kind of ROI for investing in content is just fantastic,
Yeah, I love it. And Dave, I'm curious, with those numbers I was talking about, this is kind of a side question, but when we say branded podcasts, like how do you all determine that at Chartable? Because there's nothing in the RSS feed that says, hey, I'm a branded podcast. So how do you know that?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's no official definition, right? So what I did, and this is like a very nerdy approach to it, it's the only way I know. I grabbed the top 100,000 companies out of Crunchbase, which is a directory of businesses, biased towards tech, but not just tech. So I grabbed those 100,000 companies. It also included like website URLs and the names of the companies, kind of like this metadata about the company. Mm-hmm. Chartable is part of what we do. We index, as many podcasts as we can get our hands on. So we have like 2.5 million podcasts indexed. And so what I did is I take those 100,000 Crunchbase companies in our index of 2.5 million podcasts and said, hey, what's the overlap here? Like, and there's a lot of overlap. And then I started to throw out like media companies, anything that's like building an ad-based business, like that's not branded content. That's like media, right? Which is fine. I mean, we work with wonderful, thousands of those folks. That's great. But I'm, really trying to like hone in on companies using podcasting for something other than, selling ads.
Right.
And so that's how we arrived at those numbers. And there's all kinds of different uses there. Some of it is like educational content from, whether it's not necessarily, I don't think, and I have to go back to look at the list. I don't think I included like stuff that looks like it should be an internal podcast, but yet is somehow public. Like for something for like Volvo dealership salespeople, like that's cool.
Quarterly sales results.
Yeah, exactly. It's not really like a branded podcast in the way I'm thinking about it. So I threw those out too.
Right.
And anything like media, like media ad related, I threw that out. So that's how I ended up with that list. One thing we've thought about and talked about is like trying to create some kind of quote unquote official list of branded podcasts, because there just isn't one, which is crazy because it's such a big segment of the industry.
Yeah, no, I love it. That was just more from my curiosity. I had to know that. So back to, one thing I wanted to go to is, so this show is about branding podcasts, specifically for shows created for B2B tech companies, like you're mentioning here. Yeah. So one of the biggest challenges for a brand is determining if a podcast is working, which you alluded to a second ago. So let me paint a picture here. Like on one side that we see, we have companies who just look at downloads, right? Yep. And that's all they care about, because that's all that's really available in like Buzzsprout or something. You get some other data from your listeners, like device and the platform that they're using. But that's all they really know. And then on the other side, we have folks that we know and work with where they're companies that are monitoring more qualitative feedback. So they might get a review or an email. And then there's even one gentleman that we know that is actually looking at Gong data from sales calls, and he's determining like, hey, was the podcast mentioned in calls? And that's a little bit more sophisticated on the qualitative side. But
yeah, for sure.
But like, how can Chartable help a marketer determine if their podcast is working? Very simply.
Yeah, so we've got a number of things we offer. The first is like basic analytics to supplement what you might get from your host. Depending on how you host your show, you may or may not get like everything that we offer, like basic download counting. We got that. Geographics. We've recently started offering demographics for folks on our paid plans, meaning, for folks with a big enough US audience, and this would exclude some branded shows. We'll give you household level demographics of who's listening so you can see who you're reaching. For the business use case, there's a couple of features that are super specific for B2B. One of them is the technical jargony word for it is firmographic enrichment. Anyone doing account-based sales would understand that term. But for folks who don't do that kind of sales, basically we just look at the download data, and through a partnership with Clearbit, we enrich the download data and say, hey, here are the companies of the people who are listening to your show. And we can't do that for everyone. But the quality of the data is actually really good. We tested a bunch of different vendors for this before we ended up building it. Clearbit's data is amazing. I mean, it picked up most of the Chartable team at our home offices, which I was surprised by. We're living through, again, back to the pandemic. Like, it's one thing to say, yes, this is a Facebook corporate IP address, and so anyone who's downloading a podcast from there is coming from Facebook corporate. It's another thing to say, hey, this person works at Chartable and is in New York, even though they're not, we don't know which, if they're at the office or not, but like,
Right.
looking at I saw myself and say, hey, that's me. They got me. Like, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So
and how does that work? So that's Clearbit, right? Because I know that
Yeah.
their technology is actually used in a lot of applications, right?
For sure.
To layer on.
Yep. So they're used for all kinds of sales enrichment, on the web, on mobile. We're the first application to podcasts, and so we have a partnership with them. They don't reveal where their data sources come from, but my understanding is that has to come from some kind of data sharing where folks are sharing login data or email data with them in exchange for maybe getting some enrichment back. Honestly, I don't know. But it's really good. So we're really happy to be working with them.
All right. Love it.
The other piece that we do is basically, I had mentioned that we'd already built some tech and then reconfigured it for businesses. We started out just serving like media companies, like big and small podcasters. And they had basically asked us to help them demonstrate the value of their podcast ads. They're like, look, we're selling these ads. And podcasts have this challenge, this data challenge where, for folks who are used to buying digital ads from like Facebook or Google, you can't get that same level of data back to demonstrate the ROI. Like Facebook in particular, Google also, they've had years to develop attribution where they can say, okay, this person clicked, you paid $2 for that click. And then they went and bought whatever, a mattress. And so if you scale this up, like you're going to be profitable. Your customer acquisition cost is X, like your purchase value is Y. You do the math and, you decide whether you want to buy more of these ads. Podcasts, historically, the best that people could do is offer a coupon code, like go to mattress.com/thedaily, enter code thedaily,
Right.
or click a link in the show notes, and that works for, it offers something. It basically is pushing the job of attribution off to the listener, which works in a lot of cases, but it doesn't give you the full picture because plenty of people hear the ad, it influences them, but they're not going to enter that code. So we built this full attribution product that's used by all kinds of like D2C advertisers, mobile app advertisers, who buy podcast ads at scale, millions and millions of impressions, and we have tech to help them figure out if those ads work. We've reconfigured that same tech to apply to the B2B use case where instead of saying, okay, these people heard an ad for the mattress, did they go buy the mattress? We say, these people downloaded your branded podcast. Did they come visit your website? Did they fill out a lead form or did they make a purchase, right? And it's the same tech at a different scale. And instead of, saying going from an ad on the daily to the advertiser's website, it's people downloading the branded podcast and then taking some action after that on your own website. Does that make sense?
It does, and I have some other questions.
Yeah, for
It'll
sure.
make sense to me in a second.
Yeah.
So how does, because I was reading, basically you have to put something in front of the RSS feed essentially,
That's
right?
correct. Yeah.
So that's what you put, and that's what everyone pulls on all the platforms, and that's kind of how you're stepping in front of that to collect data, right? So what are the mechanics of that exactly?
Yeah, for sure. So there's two streams of data that are really important here. The first stream is, like you had mentioned, the download data, podcast download data. And the second stream is the business website data. So we'll talk about each of those. So the podcast download data we collect directly from the user who's downloading the show. We do that by inserting, in podcast land, it's known as a prefix in the RSS feed.
Mm-hmm.
RSS feeds, every podcast has an RSS feed. And in the RSS feed is basically a list of URLs of MP3s that says, hey, here's the latest episode. Here's where to go find, the audio file for it. Go download it. And when you integrate Chartable into your feed, instead of going and downloading your MP3 from wherever it is right now, the user's podcast app first hits our server, and then we redirect to where the actual MP3 lives. And the listener, it doesn't notice anything. It'll take like 20 milliseconds for that to happen. So hopefully if they notice 20 milliseconds, they're a superhero. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
But we get to log the IP address and user agent, which is like, what you had mentioned before, just the name of the app, maybe a version number, maybe a language, some small amount of information, but nothing crazy.
Yeah.
And then they go on and download the show. And that is one super key piece of data, and we use that for Clearbit enrichment. We use it for demographic enrichment, and we use it to count downloads, all the kind of basic analytics as well. The other stream of data that's super important for this lead tracking or direct ROI measurement is business website data. So that works by the business sticking a piece of JavaScript on their website that sends information to us about who's visiting. I mean, we don't know who's visiting, but about the people who are visiting, we get IP address, what browser they're using, stuff like that. We set a cookie, and then we link up those two data streams with some very fancy technology and through a partnership with LiveRamp, which helps us actually correlate. Even if you're downloading something on your phone and you end up converting, you're visiting the mattress.com on your laptop, we use LiveRamp's like identity graph, which means that they have this huge database of traffic on the internet. And they help correlate different IP addresses, different devices, stuff like that. So we can say, okay, user A, somebody downloaded your branded podcast at 11:23 in the morning on Wednesday, and then 6 hours later they visited your website, and 20 minutes after that they ended up filling out a lead form or downloading a white paper or whatever events you care about.
Got it. And does that, Dave, lead to, because I saw mentioned in that same blog post, there is a factor or a number called the brand impact measurement. So is that what's calculated from all of it? Like, how is that number or that data derived from all of this information that you're gathering?
Yeah, so brand impact is basically our own kind of like renaming of our advertiser-facing product for the business use case, for a branded podcast use case. And so what we report back to you is, the number of downloads your branded podcast has gotten across all episodes in the last 30 days. And then we'll say, here are the number of website visitors we think are directly related to a podcast download, meaning like, they downloaded it at some time and then, within 30 days, they came and visited your website. And then you can also define, deeper in the funnel than just the website visit, like some kind of conversion. And, like I mentioned, it could be lead sign up, could be white paper, could be actually registering for some kind of account, if that's the kind of business, if it's a software business, downloading an app, any of those kinds of actions that can be tracked, using our software. And we'll give you a conversion rate saying like, okay, if you had $1,000 a year podcast, 3% of those folks ended up visiting your website. It gets a little bit more complicated than that because, nothing in podcasting is not complicated.
Right.
The big thing that tends to trip people up is that if somebody downloads your branded show on a cellular connection, meaning not just on their phone, but like also while they're not on Wi-Fi on their phone.
Okay.
We basically can't tell who that is, right? It's like,
Right.
especially, in any city, there's zillions of people sharing these IP addresses. So we try to model that behavior and say, okay, especially for branded shows, the number of people doing it on cellular is actually not that high. A lot of people are listening on their desktops even.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's not as huge of a deal for branded shows versus like advertisers. But we basically try to say, okay, we couldn't identify 10%, 30% of these people, but the other folks that we could identify converted at this rate. So we'll just, we'll make the assumption just apply that same kind of behavior.
Got it.
So that's a little in the weeds, but that's something that anyone who's like thinking about this, listening and hearing this, they're going to say, well, what about cellular? And that's the answer. So
yeah, there we go. All right. We're answering those questions before they even
before they even get asked. Maybe,
that's
we'll
a little bit of your machine learning that you have baked in
Yeah.
there.
I don't know, man. My human learning is, medium grade. We'll see.
I hear you. Well, one thing that you mentioned, you mentioned the cookie component, which is a big deal for a lot of the data that's being collected and so forth. So how do you feel like that's going to change moving forward? There's a lot of privacy issues and so forth. Like where does all of this go from here, do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's all kinds of changes with regard to privacy, both at a regulatory level, at state level, federal level in the US.
Right.
Obviously Europe has had a strong regulatory stance on privacy for a long time. And in addition to the regulatory stuff, the platforms like Apple and Google are making changes to their browsers, making changes to their operating systems. So everything is in flux right now. The way we look at it is that the things that are really going to be affected are more like Facebook ads. Like Facebook ads, like I mentioned before, this crazy individual level tracking, which is wonderful for advertising. It really demonstrates the value of the ad buy. However, it's been deemed creepy by a lot of people.
Yeah.
And is specifically being targeted by new legislation and changes in, like Apple's iOS rules, for example.
Right.
So what we think is going to happen is that rather than podcast advertising data getting worse, it's actually going to be that other digital ads are going to end up looking more like podcast ads. Like we already have to deal with a pretty limited set of data. It might get slightly more limited in the near future. We'll see, as the cookie changes roll out. But really, everyone else, if you're buying Facebook ads, you're going to get way less data over time, like for sure. It's already changing. There's already, changes with iOS 14.5, which make it harder for Facebook to do what it does across different apps. And that's only going to continue. It's going to accelerate. So we feel pretty comfortable about where we're at. We're already operating in a, compared to like Facebook ads in a data poor environment. So if it gets slightly poorer, like we're already working, we're already comfortable with that,
doing
right?
the best we can.
Doing the best we can with what we got, right? So
yeah, and I haven't heard it put that way. That's interesting. It's almost like a leveling out of the mediums, right? So everything will almost be on a similar playing field, so that marketers are dealing with a consistent level of data.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it'll take a couple of years for this to shake out. And it'll always be in flux. But what we've done, with our tech is, podcasts used to be treated just like radio, and they're not radio, right? They're digital. They're not the same as a Facebook ad. They have less data than a Facebook ad, but they certainly have more data than like a Subway poster or a radio ad, because you do have that IP address. You do have the user agent, right? And so that's not nothing. And so, there'll be changes over time, but yeah, I think that thesis that it'll end up being like more stuff will end up looking like podcasting rather than podcasting getting worse. I think that's how it's going to play out, at least in the next couple of years.
Got it. And Dave, when does it make sense for a brand to turn on Chartable for brands? Because I was on the website, I saw like the normal plans that you had, and then on the Chartable for brands, it wasn't called out separately. It largely was embedded in that blog post that you had that I saw. So, and the call to action was request the demo. So I wasn't sure exactly, if I am a marketer. If I have, let's say, a newer show, maybe less than a year, does it make sense to turn it on now? Or like, what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think, what we've designed it for folks who really want to measure the ROI of their podcast activity. And, it's not free. to do this stuff. It costs us money to do this stuff, and
Yeah.
therefore we have to, charge our users. We also hope that we're delivering something that's super valuable, and the folks that are using it, so far have been really happy. It's still really early days though. It's a brand new product for us. And so the reason we asked folks to request a demo is that we want to learn more about what people are doing. We want to learn more about what people's goals are with podcasting for their business, for their branded shows, so that we can make sure that we're not just trying to sell widgets here. This is still, new tech, new product.
Yeah.
And we like to get close to our users and try to understand what they're doing before we start asking them for big bucks or whatever.
Yeah. Got it. And so do you think it probably just helps to reach out to you?
Yep.
Because I know we have customers too. And like you said, it might be, we have some customers that, they're getting a couple hundred downloads an episode. It's really small. But then on one side, they'll tell us, hey, we were in line for an RFP. We didn't make the down select, right, to the final 3. But then all of a sudden, this potential customer heard our podcast, brought us back into the fold. So now we're competing again with these other 3 companies, and we're back in the running. And, we don't know how that story pans out yet, but it's like, goodness, that's ROI times
For sure.
100, but they just have like, sometimes, it's traditionally 50 to 150 episodes, downloads per episode. So,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So it really depends on the show, but we should still be able to get signal on that, at least as far as the company enrichment, firmographic enrichment with Clearbit. As long as it's like US, well, actually Clearbit's worldwide data is pretty good too. So I shouldn't even limit it that. If they're trying to target businesses, we can help you there, right? When it comes to actually measuring the ROI, like it's tough with like 50 or 150 downloads. Like, some chunk of those are going to be on cellular. We can't do those.
right.
How many of them are, what's our match rate going to be in terms of like getting from the download to the website and taking an action? It depends. It depends on the industry. It depends on what the action is, right?
Yeah.
And so, I think the right thing for, anyone thinking about this, listening to this and saying, hey, I wonder if this is right for me, reach out. My email is dave@chartable.com. Happy to chat. We're still in learning mode, even though we're already, we're definitely launched this product. It exists. We're selling it.
Right.
But we're still, we still like to talk to every customer individually to make sure that, it's a good fit, and also to get feedback as we get them on board.
Got it. And Dave, once someone says, all right, this does make sense for me, like what does the execution look like? Like how do you implement it? Because we mentioned, probably have to change something on the RSS side to put that prefix there, but like, what does all that look like?
It's pretty straightforward. So drop in, the prefix into the RSS feed. Most hosting platforms let you do it yourself. So you can just we have instructions for almost every platform. There's a couple that don't, but the vast majority of hosting platforms do. So that's pretty straightforward. Can be done, pretty quickly, 15 minutes or less. Your listeners, again, should not notice. When it comes to the website, it's a little bit more complicated, only because people are rightly concerned about putting other people's code on their websites. They should be, because it's it could expose you to bad stuff. We don't do that bad stuff, but other people do. It happens, right?
Yeah.
And so we have some instructions for how to do it, and for usually it involves looping in a developer on the team, or if it's if somebody's able to do it themselves, that's great, right? And so we have instructions. We walk people through it, and then we let them confirm. We basically will confirm the events that we're receiving, the website visits and stuff like that.
Gotcha. But it sounds like it's just a JavaScript snippet.
It's a snippet, right? So if you know how to put a snippet on, you can also get that done in 15 minutes or less, right?
Most of the marketers in our audience are familiar with their Facebook pixel and every other pixel
Very
that
similar
they have.
thing. Drop it in the Google Tag Manager. We got GTM instructions. It's like,
exactly.
It's no big deal. So it's like, really the only issue comes if somebody at your company is like needs, I've heard of these like pixel consoles, right? For a lot of these bigger D2C
they
brands.
exist.
They exist. And so like, that's where the pushback comes. It's like, we have to convince somebody somewhere that we're, not doing crazy stuff with their data, and we're not. And we're certified. We just completed our SOC 2 Type 2 certification, which for folks who care about security, it's like we just had everything in our systems completely audited for 3 months straight. It was like really intense.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah, it was super fun. I mean, we learned a lot.
You have to do it though.
Yeah, we got to do it. Yeah, we learned a lot. And, our hope is that it demonstrates our commitment to, security and privacy to our users, which is something that we've cared about since day one. So
yeah. All right. And so what, as you translated your product on the B2B side or the branded podcast side, like what's been the biggest surprise you've seen as you've had some of these early conversations with customers?
I've been surprised at how these shows end up getting made. Often it's somebody at the brand who just loves podcasts and wants to do it, even though they like have a hard time measuring it, a hard time justifying it, they know that it's valuable and they want to do it. And so for us, like one kind of role that I didn't really understand what we would be doing, but I kind of get it now, is that we're just giving them tools to demonstrate how valuable the stuff they're already doing is, right? Because they hear it, podcasts are a funny medium. You don't get all that much feedback from listeners, but you do hear stories like where all of a sudden you're back in the running for a big contract, right? Because somebody heard the podcast, or like a new customer, fills out the lead form and they talk to the salesperson. They're like, yeah, I just listened to 8 episodes in a row of your show. That's amazing. Right. Yeah. And so that means they just spent like 8 hours with your company. Like that's crazy talk, right? It's like unheard of in any other medium. Right. So it's like, they know that this stuff is valuable, but it can be difficult to get more resources allocated towards it, especially at larger companies. And so part of what we end up doing is giving them the tools to say, hey, we're reaching folks at all these companies that we're trying to hit. Our engagement levels are super high. And we're also seeing people come and visit the website. We should be investing more in this medium. And so that's been a fun thing to see.
Yeah, very cool. And I think you're right. Yeah, because a lot of the folks we work with, it's almost like an internal ambassador, right?
Yep,
and
for sure.
They love podcasts. And then as a marketer, it's like, I know I have a gut feel as to what this can do for us. But early on, when you're only getting, 25, 30, 50 downloads an episode, it's tough to go to your CEO and say, hey, this is crushing it on this side when you have all these other channels that have more quantitative value. So
I heard someone say, like, by the end of season 1, they're going to think I'm a moron and they're going to want to cut it. But by the end of season 2, they're going to think I'm a genius and they're going to take all the credit for it.
Ooh,
and
I love that, Dave. That's going on a quote card.
Yeah, I can't take credit for it. I forget who it came from, but I think it's totally true, because that first year you're doing it, it's just tough. You got to but you got to keep going at it. And so what we hope that we can do with our software is just give them a little bit more ammunition to say, look, no, this is working. It's starting to grow. We just got to give it some time. You draw the line out and, a couple of years down the road, you're reaching way more people. They're spending hours and hours with you. That is so valuable. And is, even though the top line number, I think one of the challenges with podcasting is that top line number of downloads is so much lower than like page views on a blog post. Yeah. But the average engagement for page views on a blog post is literally seconds.
So tiny.
Right? Yeah. So tiny. And so it's not comparable at all. And yet somehow that's what gets compared, is the download and the page view, Or somebody scrolling through a news feed, they see an ad in there for a split second and that counts. Like, it's just not the same thing. It's really not.
Yeah, exactly.
I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but
no, I love pulling in your perspective, because then I don't have to say it all the time.
All right.
Well, Dave, final question I want to ask is, I know, like you've even said here a couple times, that it's very new what you're doing with Chartable for brands. So what might be an exciting thing that you have on the horizon that people can look forward to?
We're constantly refining all of our stuff. One of the things that I think that would be helpful for branded podcasters, I come from the tech world, and part of the reason we started the company is that over the years, there's been so many wonderful like data products for people building software or mobile apps that really just like help you build better stuff, right? Mm-hmm. The stuff that the analytics tools are available now for web apps or mobile apps are just like light years ahead of what they were 15 years ago, and it just helps you build something better, faster. And so we're borrowing some of those concepts here. Like one of the ones that we're working on now is called retention. Like we've trying to show how many people come back from one episode to the next.
Oh, okay.
And we had launched a kind of preliminary version of the feature, which is like based on like 1 month cohorts. So the people that came in for the first time, listened to a show in April, how many of those folks came back in May?
Right.
And this is, of course, again, given how little data we have, it's an approximation, but we do our very best to make this like a meaningful thing to look at. The feedback we got from our customers is that it's kind of too hard to use. And so now we're trying to do it on an episode by episode level. Of the people that came in for the first time on episode 5 of your show, how many of them came back to episode 6, 7, 8, 9, 10? And the goal, for anyone making content is to get that percentage of people who come back to increase every episode,
Yeah.
And we're hoping to launch that this week, episodic retention. It's going to be paid only feature. But we're really excited about it. I think that, one of the things that we've been challenged with is that like a lot of podcast folks, I come from a super nerdy data driven background, and a lot of folks in podcasting are not that way. They're driven by their love of the craft or by a journalistic or creative impulse. And so we have to kind of both be, we have to build the tools, and then we also have to educate in a way that like actually connects and makes sense with people. And that's been, a challenge. It's been hard. So we hope to launch this thing, but then also to make it something that people can actually use, not just some crazy number in a dashboard somewhere. But that's something I'm really excited about.
Very cool. Episodic retention. Got it written down. Awesome.
Got to rebrand it. It's not like the best. It's kind of a mouthful, but
that's all right. That's the other side of the coin. That's the challenge on the product marketing side. All right. Well, Dave, lastly, where can people go to find out more about yourself and Chartable? Yeah.
Well, you can always check out chartable.com. And you can find me on Twitter is probably the best place. D as in David, Z as in zebra, OHROB. Or hit me up over email, dave@chartable.com. And I really appreciate you having me on. Appreciate everyone listening. It's been really nice.
Yeah, this has been fun, Dave. I know these are a lot of questions that we get because we meet with our customers on a weekly basis. And
for sure.
We're always working through these things.
Well, I really appreciate
and quantitative data. So yeah, we'll point our customers and some other folks in our audience to this episode for sure. So thanks for joining me on Recorded Content.
Thank you.